All right. Hello. I was trying to think of really good hold music for everyone entering the waiting room. And I thought of Work Bitch by Britney Spears. But then we'd have to do some kind of like content warning on our YouTube thing. So just imagine that that's playing while we're getting started. Um, as we do on all of these happy hours for the Guild, please post your social media handles on whatever platforms are left these days, on whatever new platforms are rising from the ashes of other platforms. Things have changed perhaps since the last time we were all together. So tell us where you are these days, please. I am thrilled for this discussion today. We are talking about I think, under-discussed topic in this realm, which are the people who make craft beer. We are talking about this with Dr. Eli Revelle Yano Wilson, who has joined us so generously today. And Dave Infante will be leading this conversation. Dave, hopefully, is a guild member that you all know well. So if you do not, Dave is a beer business reporter and podcaster for VinePair. He publishes Fingers, a newsletter about drinking in America that is one of the first things I read when it's in my inbox. Two-time winner of the James Beard Foundation Award for Journalism, among many other things. Also a dear personal friend of mine. Dave, thank you for hosting this discussion. There was no one else on the topic of workers that I would think of to host this discussion. So thank you for being here.
Thank you for the lovely intro, Kate.
I do my best. And then also with us today, again, Dr. Wilson, an associate professor in the Department of Sociology and Criminology. So hopefully you have crime questions prepared, Dave, at the University of New Mexico. Also the author of numerous books that I think would be of interest to everyone on this call. For the purposes of this conversation, we are talking about his newest book, the copy of which I left upstairs on my bedside table. I was planning to hold it up and demonstrate. Dave can do it. Beautiful. It's called Beer and Society, Handcrafted Careers Working in the Artisan Economy of Craft Beers. It's a really fascinating read if you are a sociology nerd like me. It's really fascinating to see data and conversations behind, I think, some of the things that maybe some of us assume or think we know, but to really see an academic approach to the labor force of craft beer was really eye-opening. I highly recommend this book. We are running a discount on it. If you buy it, send me a receipt and we will reimburse you a portion of the purchase price. So buy the book. With all of that, I'm going to hand it over to Dave and Dr. Wilson to chat. Please, if you have questions, drop them in the chat for us so we can hopefully get to them at the end. Thanks so much.
All right. We all good? I have a... Oh, no, there we go. Okay, cool. Thank you so much, Kate. All right. Dr. Wilson, let's get into it, man. Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for... Take yourself off mute. Yeah, it's you and me. Everyone else has to just listen, but you get to talk, man.
There is a kind of intimacy with Zoom, so that seems apt.
Yeah, people say that all the time about Zoom. It's very intimate. Yeah, that's what people love the most about it. Although, yeah, it is. There's like a little bit of people are watching us. This is exciting. So, look, man, I appreciate you being here. Obviously, I read a lot about the labor movement as it intersects with the beverage alcohol industry. You have written this probing and extensive survey or study, or well, I say it's a book length. Would you call this a survey? What do people in academia call this type of book? Ethnography? No.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head.
Yeah.
I'm a qualitative sociologist, so I deal, I tread in in-depth interviews. field research. I do a lot of what we call participant observation. That's a kind of nerdy way of saying, I don't know, I try to get up close and personal with the data, whether that's a
Hmm.
particular kind of workplace or a type of work or stuff like that. So yeah, you're on the right track.
When did you first get into craft beer yourself? I mean, that is a part of this book. I mean, obviously that's just sort of your personal background, but I think a lot of people would be interested. When did you first stumble into this world?
Yeah, and gosh, what a different time it was. Dave, you've been around this industry way longer than I have, but I mean, I've sort of seen it go through a few different evolutions. I first got into it, I was coming out of my undergraduate education on the East Coast. I was one of those sort of wide-eyed, bushy-tailed folks who wanted to open a brewery. I was increasingly obsessed with craft beer. Became a certified Cicerone, moved to LA. Just by chance, a couple of my cousins who were just a little bit older than me had just opened this spot, this gourmet beer, Belgian, German influenced beer and sausage place in downtown Arts District, LA, called Verskuka. And I came to be part of the opening team there. So I was kind of immersed in the beer world, in increasingly kind of enmeshed in everything craft beer, starting around 2009,
Yeah.
and was in the industry. Well, I sort of phased out doing consulting work by about 2015.
Yeah, yeah. And what was so 2009 LA, we're coming up, like the second boom is really starting to pick back up. Like from an industry perspective, the industry goes through a slump in the late 90s, early aughts. A lot of sort of businesses that like weren't about that life and were like brewing, pretty bad beer or just didn't really have the business model dialed in. They wash out. But by 2009, stuff's kind of back on the up and up, at least in the national numbers. You start to see it. What was it like in LA at that time?
There's a lot of excitement. There's a lot of excitement, not because we were one of those sort of landed, mature craft beer hubs like a Denver or a Portland or even a San Diego,
San Diego,
but
yeah.
mainly because we saw that potential was there,
Hmm.
right? So imagine, this sort of aspirational excitement of what could be, coupled with the fact that LA is this huge and at that time somewhat untapped craft beer market, of which we got the joy. I was boots on the ground at the time, and I got the joy of firsthand kind of seeing people's, kind of minds being blown by what beer could be.
Yeah.
It was a really exciting time, and I think 2009, 2010, LA was playing catch up, and I think
Mm,
that was really exciting to be part of that, just firsthand for me, for
yeah.
sure.
I think like joy and excitement are obviously like sentiments or emotions that make a lot of appearances throughout handcrafted careers, and you deal with sort of the way that those emotional responses to this industry and this sort of beverage, and the two are not the same, of course. The liquid is not the same as the industry that makes it, but like that appears quite a bit. And one of the things I think like would be a good way to start here, we're already started, but is you ultimately chose, I read, I think in the preface or the intro of the book, you describe your choices personally on your own career pathways are obviously a big part of your book here, but like you wound up going into academia. You wound up pursuing your PhD and getting your PhD, your dissertation. You defended your dissertation. uh the academy and the brewery strike me as like pretty different places, or different institutions. um I'm curious, are they similar in any way? You made a decision to pursue one versus the other. Uh, how do you sort of see them, these different parts of your life? Are there similarities that are productive for this conversation, you think, or not so much?
I think there are definitely similarities. I'll start with just a brief note about their differences, right?
Please.
Academia works really slowly. It's intellectual labor, immaterial in nature, and it's in that sense it's very different from craft beer, particularly stuff I learned in just thinking about the brew house and thinking about those more sort of hands-on stuff that's really core to like craft, in that sense. But the similarities, a quick little detour that I promise is connected. I just gave a talk about this book, a colloquium at University of New Mexico, for kind of an audience of different kind of academics in different disciplines. And by the time I closed the conversation, we were thinking about, what drives so many people in craft beer. Of course, my argument, I'm sure we'll talk about, is related to passion. It's a true kind of emotional resonance of this work, that at its core kind of provides the engine for why many people, not everyone, but many people pursue this work.
Mm.
And as that conversation was wrapping up in this colloquium, I just saw so many people whispering and kind of chuckling to each other in the audience. And finally, somebody raised their hand to go, you could be talking about academics right now. Because so many of us sort of have this romanticism, I'm talking about us in the academic sense, that the reason we do what we do is because we love it. We study what we are genuinely passionate or interested in. And that's a kind of maybe a little bit of an unexpected connection between what I saw in the craft beer industry and, amongst academics in an ivory tower,
Yeah.
seemingly a very different context.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's bad, right?
What specifically?
No, I'm kidding.
Oh.
Just the idea of like being passion driven and that being an engine of like an economy, like the craft beer industry. Of course, the academy in the United States is meant to operate like a business, but that's a relatively new trend. I mean, that's not what the academic institutions of higher learning really were built for. They've become that way over the course. They've been perverted, maybe over the course of the past, whatever, 50 years or so. But craft brewing is a business first and foremost. And the fact that people enter it, through personal passion or obsessive, creativity or any of the things you get into in your book strikes me as, and I do some of this reporting and I know others on this call have done that type of reporting as well. It strikes me as an opening for exploitation and for burnout and for some of the things that you discuss in the book. I was obviously kind of joking, but also kind of not. Like, we won't ask you to make a moral judgment on this matter right at the top of our conversation, but maybe by the end, I think I would certainly like to hear more of your personal thoughts on whether it's your colleagues in the academy or the folks you talk to in the brew house, whether on balance this is a productive and additive dynamic or maybe an unproductive and exploitative dynamic. But I'm getting way ahead of myself here. I'm sorry, man. Before we even do that, and sorry to everyone else, we're going to be all over the place today. We should start with the definition of terms. We should get into the definition of terms before we get any further. What is a handcrafted career?
Oh, yeah. So yeah, in the book, obviously I titled the book that, and I was really thinking about, I'm a sociologist of work. I study work, social inequality, race and ethnic issues. And, I was really drawn to the fact that there was this very traditional conception of what a career could be. And, if we go back, I realize this sounds very quaint because we haven't been here in a long time, but let's call this in the mid 20th century where a career was something you kind of got in at the bottom of a company and you sort of rode out this fairly linear, somewhat predictable pathway, particularly if you were a man, and particularly a middle class man or working class sort of union folk. But it was a predictable kind of linear thing. And there was I was struck that there was no real language to capture how these workers in an industry like craft beer kind of go about assembling their career in ways without a blueprint, for instance, and kind of putting one foot in front of another, following things that interest them, making detours and strange squiggly lines based on who they knew and where they, what sort of tickled their fancy at that moment. So there was no language for this, right? So I coined this term handcrafted careers, not only to describe careers that had this kind of lumpy, organic, almost crafted quality, but also and I think quite crucially, that I was thinking about what was the engine behind these kinds of careers, these kind of handcrafted careers, of which I kind of argue that there's a set of values and identities that really animate, why I do this and where am I going and sort of how do I make sense of it. So what I mean by values is, the workers that I talked to while interviewing for this research, They talk, a lot of their language about why are they in this kind of employment is very value driven. It
Yeah.
has to do with what do they hold dear, and also more than that, how do they see themselves? So, that's where ideas about authenticity and like artisanship become front and center in terms of not just these things that are nice around them, but the real kind of engine, as I'm sort of repeating that word maybe a little too much, but the engine that is moving their careers in a particular direction. So those qualities, the lumpy, crafted nature of it, coupled with that sort of value and identity component, are what I argue make for this concept of a handcrafted career.
Yeah. Lumpy and organic is also what my doctor told me I was today in my
Yeah.
physical. She was she
I,
told me less than
that
that.
conversation go in multiple ways, yes.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so you've got this concept of the handcrafted career, and frankly, I think that this is something, that folks on this happy hour will be familiar with. I mean, journalism and media more generally, as it has disintegrated over the course of the past decade and a half, has necessitated paraprofessionals or paraprofessionalism, as you might put it, assembling handcrafted careers out of like I said, necessity instead of out of interest. And certainly passion, I think, dictates and drives a lot of the work that guild members do, that journalists do, that academics do, although maybe to different outcomes. But let's get into you break the book up into as I mentioned earlier, this idea of career pathways, and this is, I think, a pretty effective, or at least I found it effective, organizing framework to sort of examine the different ways that the craft beer industry, the craft brewing industry more broadly, I suppose, um sort of offers opportunities to some groups, if not at the expense of others, maybe at the exclusion of others, inadvertently. But the first one, I think it's the first one in the book, is what you call careers of the heart, which I thought was good. This idea of sort of like the creative pathway, and that one's the one that, like, I feel like the narrative is the most fleshed out, because in consumer facing, media coverage of the craft brewing industry over the course of last decade, this idea of kind of the mad scientist, savant brewer who's driven to create, right, and who is not interested in the less sexy or less sort of intellectually challenging aspects of the business, that was lionized, right? And sort of there's a whole mythology sort of assembled around that type of character. Can you talk a little bit about sort of how you define, like, the career of the heart, and how you see it, how you saw it in your research manifesting within the brew house?
Yeah. Yeah, so this creative pathway, and I'll back up a second to explain the logic behind like
Please.
why do I organize the book this way?
Sure.
Imagine one of the things I tell my students this all the time when they're about to embark on a new project. I think one of the points of intrigue about the craft beer industry, particularly some years ago, was that there wasn't sort of a fixed kind of organizational structure that, had these very clear career paths, like, for instance, the medical industry, or something of that nature. And so the first thing I set my task to was just sort of laying out what are the key pathways
Mm,
of which people's careers most often kind of play out in. That is, what kind of jobs are linked to others, and then what are what we would call in sociology like the social organization of the industry, right? Like, so in terms of the demographics, who tends to do what type of job? And so to your point, or what you asked earlier, the creative pathway was that dominant pathway, dominant not just in terms of maybe sort of numerically, but it also has a kind of prominence in the industry. You talked about journalistic coverage, but also just in the lore, as you said,
yeah,
of,
yeah.
of sort of who works in craft beer and why, and who, that sort of romantic notion of like what it's like to work in craft beer. And so, yeah, these are jobs that I talk about have a kind of creative authority to them. They tend to have more flexibility, more autonomy, and they tend to be a little closer to the actual artisanal craft of
Mm.
like making beer, making recipes, those sort of things. And this is a pathway that still, to get into a little bit of the critical detail of the book, this is a pathway that is still dominated by white men, right?
Hmm.
Or as I call it in the book, I talk about sort of bearded white guys, of which I definitely was one of them. By the way, I still have sort of the vague semblance of it, but the full beard and the flannel wearing, that was me in my 20s for sure. Um, so I kind of dig into how do those careers develop? How do people on the creative pathway kind of enter the industry? If we think of the language of a pathway, there's kind of a beginning, there's a middle, there's a sort of a direction to it. It's not just one sort of moment in time. And I was really drawn to that idea, right?
Yeah.
How do people kind of proceed along a pathway or potentially get diverted to different pathways, which goes into subsequent chapters of the book.
Yeah, there was a period, Dr. Can I call you Eli? What do
You
you
call me
prefer to
Eli.
go by?
No, no,
Okay,
no.
cool. Eli, there was a period in the 2010s. I don't know if this is registered for you. Maybe blessedly you avoided ever hearing this phrase, but a lot of PR people were pushing this idea that chefs are the new rock stars, right? And then some other PR people took that idea and tried to advance it a little bit further and said, brewers are the new rock stars. How triggering of a phrase is that to you?
Well, it's very fitting. It's very fitting of what I'm of the stuff I'm talking about, right? When we
Yeah.
think about craft
Yeah.
beer's sort of founding fathers and all that sort of gendered language that exists, I mean, we all know who we're talking about here, and they all come from a very similar mold when you look at sociologically speaking, and that is really capturing that essence of sort of who is idealized on this creative pathway, who sort of looks, walks, and acts like they belong, and who might be sort of well networked to succeed in that pathway
Yeah.
in many ways, right? So, yeah,
How does yeah.
yeah.
Sorry, yeah, I just had to get that in there. I wanted just to kind of poison your brain a little bit so that could just maybe inflect your work in the future, upsetting as that may be. But, who gets to do the work? Who gets to stay on the creative pathway in the craft brewing industry? I mean, this is a little bit of a layup because I think a lot of people know the answer. You certainly do. But what were your findings on who gets to stay on the creative pathway versus move into the service pathway or move into the hard labor pathway or whatever the case may be? And how do they stay on that creative pathway?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, again, I kind of break, the ideas of the chapter are kind of broken into that entry point,
Yep.
how they sort of enter onto this pathway as opposed to others. And then to your point, sort of who ends up succeeding, there's no profound spoiler there. It tends to be these bearded white guys. Now, why is that? Is a combination of the way they're able to kind of leverage their resources, both in economic terms, but also in social terms.
Mm.
And also in terms of a cultural dynamic, who can, who feels comfortable belonging in a space that is deeply coded in kind of a kind of white masculinity, a kind of artisan version of white masculinity.
Sort of like
Folks who are sitting around in their jeans and t-shirts, doing bottle shares, sitting on top of kegs,
yeah.
waiting for beers to ferment. Who kind of feels the most comfortable, sort of making sense of that day in and day out reality, and that operates as a kind of screening device amidst all of the other more structural factors. Again, the point of interest here is thinking about who stays, right?
Mm.
It's one thing to talk about, women making entry into this space or workers of color, both male and female. But it's another thing entirely to think more about who is staying and why. And I think that's what the language of pathways really captures better than, again, looking at these sort of slices that a lot of statistics might, give one a sense of, who's doing what when. But I wanted to see something more longitudinal, something that spoke to, how people's biographies, how people's sort of life courses play out in this industry, with these patterns in mind.
Yeah. I think the image or the sort of like tableau of the bottle share and people kind of hanging out in I'm envisioning like a blonde like sleek wood surface, you know, maybe a post-industrial second tier city with like no major pro sports teams, but it's like on the up and up, you know. It's a very like fucking like Lumineers ass aesthetic, you know,
Sure.
like very like Mumford and Sons type stomp clap shit. And that's not a milieu that everyone is comfortable in. And yet that is also a milieu that got the craft brewing industry to where it got last decade. And it was doing quite well until whatever 2019, 2020, and then obviously the pandemic kind of nudged it over the edge, and it's been kind of struggling ever since. But I say that to say, it feels cliche now to sort of reflect on, and it's easier to see now what the cliche is, the aesthetic and the social, you know, networks that sort of emerged out of breweries or in the craft beer industry. But I wanted to sort of unpack a little bit, because I think a lot of times, like especially like when I was covering, when I would cover like race of brewers or gender stuff like this, a lot of people get very defensive about the idea that um this was something that needed to be covered at all. I'm sure you've encountered that sentiment in your work, but I do think there's like some kernel of legitimate, like, grievance, maybe not the right word, but like it fucking worked for a little while, right? Like it did kind of produce a culture, and there are always going to be problems with a niche or a you know, like a subculture like craft brewing, but for a time it was economically successful, which as an industry has to be a priority. Can you there's a I guess I'm this is a rambling question. I'm sorry, Eli.
I think I'm
Uh
following you.
yeah, there seems to be a tension, you know, and I certainly encounter in my work between, um, you know, we know that that's kind of not what's going to get the industry where it needs to go, and that's maybe not as productive and fruitful for its workforce. And yet, it is also the reason the industry is here in the first place. And how do you hold those two ideas together?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. It's a complicated one, right? Because now we're talking about that d double-edged nature
Mm,
of, you know, operating and being immersed in a kind of workplace, in a kind of job that is of which passion is the beating heart, right? I mean,
mm,
and I say double-edged sword here because I'm very aware from, you know, from folks I talk to and just experiences I had in different brew houses. There's a deep love of working in an environment that I'm recalling some quotes of, you know, folks I've talked to over the years, you know, that people would talk about as being built for people like me.
yeah, yeah,
You know, where work all of a sudden doesn't feel like work anymore, and it's just this sort of seamless, you know, there's this blurry and seamless flow between things that I do as a hobby, the
yep.
tastes I have in music, and the people I want to be around, and the things I want to be doing. There's a deep love for that, and I think it's pretty obvious to understand why.
Mm,
And you know, I'm not even going to go as far as to say that that's wrong necessarily. I think, you know, what I want to point out, as many of these, many of people on this call would well know and have written about, you know, so I am definitely talking to folks who I'm sure this is not like groundbreaking. This is not too groundbreaking, I don't think. But, you know, there's an exclusionary element to all that. Right. I mean, if I work and I'm increasingly building, almost insulating my workplace as a place for people like me in cultural terms, social terms, even physical layout, you know, it's obviously worth considering who's on the outside of that looking on or looking in.
yeah, yeah.
And I think that's that double-edged nature that, you know, the book really tries to unpack, not just in this chapter, but across people who work on different pathways as well.
Yes, and I think there was I interviewed Garrett Oliver, who's the brewmaster at Brooklyn Brewery a few months ago, and he made a extended sort of analogy of like breweries that sort of insulate themselves from developing a more diverse workforce, developing a more diverse consumer base, are like kind of practicing like a cultural incest of sorts. It's like eventually going to like water down and destroy their, you know, like institutional bloodline. It was quite an analogy. I liked it a lot. This is more we can talk about incest later. Maybe that's a different call. But I thought it was an interesting point, and maybe a little tangent to what you were talking about just a moment ago. But let's move on to the next chapter, or I don't think it's the direct next one, but another. I've in my notes here one of the chapter that I think is titled "We Like to Have Fun" gets at sort of this idea of you talk about craft consumption and this idea that these handcrafted careers, especially, or not exclusively, but often in the service pathway, demand a sort of, I think the way you put it is an extra commitment. This idea, some of the examples that you had in the book, like this idea of, oh, we're going to stick around after hours to do the bottle share. I'm really obsessive about this. I got super into this type of beer, and that's how I got into it. And I know, the portfolio back and forth because I fucking love it. And not everyone has access, or not access, maybe is not the right word, but not everyone has the same opportunity to commit themselves in that way to this consumptive performance of their job. Can you talk a little bit about what that dynamic sort of dictates in the brewing industry, like who gets to participate in that, and for the folks that don't, what that means for their pathway?
Yeah. Yeah, so the service pathway is really interesting to me. I mean, just the first thing to note, again, I'm sure most of the folks on this call have already well know this, but I think something that's really striking for folks less familiar with craft beer is 1 out of every 2 service workers, customer-facing workers, are women in this industry, amidst this sort of sea of mostly men. So that becomes a point of kind of sociological interest and perhaps a little bit of a puzzle to unpack, like what's going on here. But the patterns actually are become quite recognizable when you recognize that service work is a deeply feminized sort of trade in our sort of economy writ large, right? So if we think about restaurant servers, or as they perhaps used to be called in more gender terms, waitresses, right? So and one of the things that was really interesting about kind of tracking the career development of folks who go into this kind of customer-facing position is it took 2 forms, and there was a gender dimension for women working in the service pathway. Much of it was actually coming from the restaurant industry. So your classic, being a server, part-time or full-time at another establishment, that establishment started to take on craft beer handles, or, just more familiarity with craft beer, and then sort of one way or another finding your way over to a brew pub or a tap room and
Yeah.
working in that environment. For men, what I found was what was more common was taking sort of the consumer path. So starting as somebody obsessive or very passionate about drinking and being around craft beer, and then kind of transitioning from that consumer role to one of which you work kind of in customer facing roles. So in other words, kind of inverting one's relationship from consumer to not producer is the right word, but customer facing worker, and sort of playing and straddling both worlds, right? When you clock in and out, sometimes quite literally. So there was kind of 2 pathways as folks entered, but you're absolutely right. Not everybody who works in service environment, and I would say increasingly these days, is obsessed with craft beer. I mean, I'm noticing around in California and in where I'm at right now, which is in New Mexico, a lot of craft breweries that are opening their 3rd or 4th tap room or have become a little bit more corporate in feel. They're hiring folks directly from sports bars and from folks who just want that classic part-time service job making tips. That's a very different relationship. It's traditional to the service industry, but I would actually say it's a little bit new to the craft beer industry, because it doesn't have that anchor of being passionate about either brewing or consuming craft beer. But definitely a trend that's noteworthy that I think we're seeing. I mean, perhaps you know more about that.
No, I think you're right. Obviously, that as craft brewing has sort of spread its wings and become whatever, I don't know, a teenage industry, an adolescent industry. I don't know where
Growing
it is.
pains for sure,
Yeah,
if that's the
whatever.
case.
It's exactly. Yeah, there's constant growing pains for this industry, this poor industry. It's just constantly going through puberty. It never ends. But yeah, no, like and I also think culturally it's become a lot less cool to be obsessive about craft beer than it was in 2009 and certainly in 2015. because it's not the hot new thing. There's a bunch of, factors that have kind of led to it being backburnered culturally, or even becoming a little bit of a caricature of itself
Yeah.
culturally. So certainly, like, the workforce has to, by nature, uh, uh, I mean, you got to staff these places, and there's just not nearly as many people who are hardcore and like had a Mr. Beer kit, and then like got really, like, went for the Cicerone exam, and that was so much more of a thing a
Right.
decade ago. So the workforce, I think it stands to reason that, folks who are picking up these gigs now aren't necessarily like the true believers.
Yeah.
And I think, I mean, uh, to some extent, that's going to change the industry, just because those are the people who are going to be the first line that customers see. But they're also not the owner class, and they're not the creative, they're not on the creative pathway. So their control, or their influence on sort of the direction of the industry and its relationship to its workforce is, to me, somewhat limited. This is another rambling question, but how do you see those service pathways, and especially those, at one point in the book, hang on, let me reference my notes here. At one point in the book, you speak about workers who find themselves sort of in a purgatory between like temp and lifer. And that strikes me as a tough place to be. It's sort of like when you're water skiing and you're neither like up nor down, you're just kind of getting hit in the face with a bunch of water, because you don't really have control over your career path, but you also like can't really bail on it right then. Can you talk a little bit about how that shapes, or maybe ought to shape workers' expectations about their what they can expect in their workplaces, what they can expect out of career satisfaction, where these careers could go in their imagination? Like, how does
Mhm.
that, I mean, because that is a weird place to be.
Yeah. Well, I think there's, I mean, I'm glad you raised that question. I think there's two ways to go with that. You know, well, one way is to talk about, the obligatory questions that we have to cover, which is, just some of the economic limitations of working in craft beer, some of the sacrifices, and thus, there's kind of this natural kind of capping of what these careers can be for
Yeah.
workers.
Yeah.
For many workers, there's of course there's a few exceptions, but they are the exceptions. There's another way to go with that question, which is to think about something that actually I should have raised earlier in thinking about different pathways in craft beer that I found, which is that there's kind of a hierarchy involved here as well. I referred to the creative pathway as the dominant pathway. Um, it goes deeper than that in a relational sense, in terms of thinking about the creative pathway as that dominant pathway, vis-a-vis the service pathway, or what I describe in the book as the hard labor pathway,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
are these sort of subordinate pathways that are perhaps even more capped in kind of autonomy and vision, and sometimes the economic possibilities that these careers can provide.
Yeah.
Working in service industry, this is a truism of that actually goes back to my other research on restaurants. It can be fantastic for folks if you find yourself in a high-tipped environment of which you want flexibility and part-time work. It means something entirely different when you start thinking about this as a career, right? Something long-term, something that has a kind of reputation, things that you might want if you're going to do this work for a long time. And I think that's precisely where the service pathway shows its limitations,
Mm.
right? If you're working in a frontline customer-facing role, it could be a blast. It could tickle that itch that you scratch that itch you want scratched. But doing it over time, right? Where do these careers go? There's a limited kind of upward mobility trajectory. One can kind of get stuck in the service pathway in a way that I think that stuckedness is not as prominent if you are able to make your way onto the creative pathway. And for those, again, mostly white men operating in that context. So I think there's two dimensions to thinking about sort of what does this mean for career pathways in terms of sort of getting stagnant.
Let me ask you a question. This is a little bit more of a pointed's not the right word, but like this is a question that I'm hoping maybe steers us into a more action or remedy oriented moment in this conversation. Uh, and no, this is pointed. Here we go. How much of that is real? Service industry, or excuse me, service pathway actually being capped, and there only being sort of certain outcomes that you can really hope for. And how much of that is a narrative that is very favorable to the owner class, to not have workers that think that they have an opportunity to have a career that or can't have a job that pays their mortgage and allows them to have kids. I mean, I remember there was a quote in here that I have underlined in the book from one of and it was a woman on the service pathway that you interviewed, and it's like, hey, this is good for now, but it can't ever, like, this is not going to be my forever job. And I think that's a sentiment that you encounter in restaurants. I think it's certainly one that you encounter in breweries to some extent, more so now that the industry has had the downturn that it's had over the course of the past few years. To some extent in journalism at this point, because the rates haven't changed in 20 years and actually maybe getting worse. It's good for now, but it's not for later. How much of that is real? Like, in your research, Eli, people are making money in this business. Where is it fucking going? Because I'm not getting any of it. Actually, Venmo me $5, Eli. I need it right now. Please just give me some money. Give me some money.
Yeah.
No, I'm kidding though. But like, how much of that is real in your research? Like, and how much of it is a perception that is convenient and expedient for the bosses?
Yeah. Oh man. I mean, yeah, I see somebody put in the
Join
chat
me at the
that's
barricades.
an evergreen question. Absolutely. I mean, I think it's to your point, I think it's a very convenient narrative for management to, and a pragmatic one as well, to hire folks on a part-time basis, compensate them in kind, at least in part, free beer, flexible shifts, ability to wear whatever you want, play the music you want. All these things kind of read really well, particularly for a younger,
Yep.
kind of people more junior in their work careers. And so to keep that kind of churning, hopefully not too fast because that creates problems for businesses, but to just have this steady stream of folks working part-time and wanting something very specific, fitting this part-time job, or it's a short-term job, within this sort of larger assemblage of what they want to do long-term, that's something different in their life. That's all a really, really convenient, convenient narrative, right? So in other words, if I'm an owner and that's going to be folks who are constantly submitting applications for these taproom positions, why would I create job ladders, right? Pathways into management that involve more training and more authority, given to these individuals? What's the incentive, right? So while, I'm very much on the side of, folks who are going to work hard and are willing to, kind of learn the ropes and take on more authority. Let's give them a pathway so that they can be, have a greater say in what this company is and where it's going. I mean, that's ultimately where I'm headed, but that's a narrative that fits best for folks who are committed to this career path, right? And I said, as I said earlier, I think management is, to get a little critical about it, right? Management is incentive, not necessarily to incubate these individuals that require more training and time, and rather than just a kind of plug and chug in a way of folks who will work these part-time jobs and be gone, in a year or two.
Yeah.
That's a little crude, but I think you get where I'm going with that.
Oh, I definitely get. Yeah, and I think that, that squares with my reporting and the folks I talk to in the industry. And when you go try to do sort of worker oriented reporting in this space, you often hear the frustrations that I tried to give voice to in that previous question, or at least I do. And then when you talk to the owners, they're lamenting all of the risk that they took on to open this brewery, and they're heavily leveraged and they're underwater, and please come buy my stainless steel because it's running at
Yeah,
20% utilization. But that's a you problem, man. That's not a me problem. But let's talk a little bit about the hard labor pathway, because this is where my eyes started twitching a little bit, and I became very distressed for this one guy that you interviewed. I think his name was Josiah, maybe.
Jose,
Yeah. And he actually had a quote. I wrote it down here because I think it was like it was a subheader in the chapter about the hard labor pathway where he says, quote, "My mentality is embrace the shit. Nobody cares. Work harder." Close quote. Can you talk about, I mean, like that, like very distressing to me. I consider myself a worker. I also, have organized before and cover the labor movement to some extent. That strikes me as a very, very self-defeating sentiment, and yet it's one that you encountered in various I mean, that was the most explicit version of it, I think. It's a great quote. But it's one that you encountered a lot in different capacities on the hard labor pathway. Can you talk a little bit about why that sort of embrace the suck type, embrace the shit in Josiah's words, why that seems to be so appealing on that pathway in particular? Because there's hard work going on all the pathways. I don't think anybody who's seen, a tap room bartender move up and down the bar on a busy, happy hour shift would say they're not working hard. And yet that does seem to be very coded to feats of strength, male manual labor, and that's true I think in a lot of industries maybe, but you studied it in the brew house. Can you talk a little bit about why that is, or why you found that to be?
Yeah, a quick comment here. You had that slip of tongue to instead of, I think it was, I used the quote, embrace the shit.
Yeah.
Interestingly, that was actually something my editor wanted me to change because,
Really?
so sorry, the original quote is actually embrace the suck, which I was going to title, the original title of that chapter was embrace the suck, and then there was a subheader. And I had a couple beta readers look at it and go, this is too sexual. This is too sexual. We're not going to embrace the suck. That's not going to be your header. It might take people's minds down a totally different path. So I
Yeah.
changed it to embrace the shit. So it was funny to hear you kind of have
Well,
that.
embrace the suck, I believe, just to add another psychosexual layer to this, I believe is like a army or like a military, like special ops, like thing to say. It's
Interesting.
like a
Okay.
Navy SEALs type shit. Yeah, it's like, I mean, I don't know if they actually say it, but it's like goofy. Yeah, Kate says it's also embraced in the ultra running world, which I am not a part of.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Well,
I don't know.
so Kate, if you were
That's none of my
the only
business.
type of reader, maybe I'd be okay.
Okay.
Anyway, it was just an interesting feedback from
Yes.
folks,
Stop evading the question, Eli. You have to
Okay.
answer.
So to get back to your question, yeah, I mean, I think the hard labor pathway was really interesting. It's a pathway of folks who are primarily tasked with doing kind of mundane and monotonous physical labor.
Mhm.
So whether that's in the brew house, if it's in the brew house, it's in sort of these lowest capacities. Transferring, beer from the bright tank to a fermenter or stuff like that. But it's also stuff like delivery driving and, running canning, being a canning line operator. So it's all these tasks that occur in the back of sort of increasingly behind the scenes in these sort of invisible jobs, at least within the craft beer imaginary. And I'm one last comment before I get to your point. I think it's worth noting something I pay attention to in the book, that based on recent kind of industry demographics, this is the pathway. These are the types of jobs that are disproportionately occupied by men of color.
Mm.
Now we know proportionately. I mean, it's a very small sort of number in total of men of color working in this industry, but they are mostly concentrated here, right?
Yeah, the bar
So these are
chart is
jobs
like
with low
just
authority.
yeah,
What's
right.
that?
Like the
Yeah.
bar chart is just like
Absolutely.
that
Yeah.
column is
So
very high. Yeah.
totally overrepresented. And so that's really important to kind of frame. I may make the point in the book, or at least I've been talking with colleagues, that this operates as a kind of racial outsourcing in this industry, that the creative jobs, the jobs of passion, the jobs that sort of the folks who are in these dominant positions want, are kind of occupied by sort of those bearded white guys, and all the work that is undesirable or just needs to get done in an obligatory sense are oftentimes kind of outsourced to workers from more disadvantaged backgrounds, particularly men of color. So all of that kind of frames this, who's working on the hard labor pathway and what kind of jobs exist, what kind of tasks exist. Now to your point about, sort of this one individual, Josiah, who's a Native American man, kind of putting his head down and just doing his work. I think there's a lot going on there, and I don't want to get too idiosyncratic to just the case of Josiah. He has a
Mhm.
military background. He worked a string of kind of low-end service jobs prior to landing in breweries. And so part of his mentality of just sort of like putting his head down, keeping his job, doing the task that was set out in front of him was, I mean, one could frame it as a kind of self-defense, employment self-defense. Like just let me do this job and let me not get in trouble and don't bother me, right?
Yeah.
It does raise really vexing issues for this broader question about organizing workers and how do workers participate in this collective task of making better quality jobs in this industry, right? I don't think somebody like Josiah had an answer that I remember him telling me to those bigger questions.
Yeah.
So, you
Yeah.
know, I'm gonna pivot and dodge here, Dave, because I don't it's nothing comes to mind offhand that answers that question. It's a really good one that you asked about what does this mean for organizing.
Let me redirect a little bit and talk about the connective tissue or lack thereof between the pathways, because it strikes me as someone like a Josiah or anyone on the hard labor pathway. One of his friends or one of the other guys you spoke with came from the distribution world and then worked in the cellar, and the also on the hard labor pathway. I believe his fellow workers referred to him as the keg gorilla,
Uh-huh.
because of how strong he was, and he took a lot of pride in that. That is not a person with, I don't want to use an academic term that I may be wrong about, but like I would use the term like social capital. Doesn't have a lot of leverage to improve his position on his own within the brew house, but someone on the creative pathway who might be white and who might have a stronger network and might have entree into that craft consumption that you described, and my hackneyed analogy about the stomp clap aesthetic, like they have a lot more leverage to improve not only their condition but also potentially their coworkers on the hard labor pathway. Do they think of themselves as coworkers?
Yeah,
Ish.
ish. If ish is the if we're going to lean hard into ish, I would actually say yes.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons why is, obviously, as you all know, a lot of these brewing companies are really small operations, right? I mean, statistically, that kind of bears out. And so, first of all, on a practical level, there's just you're not very far away from. It's pretty easy to know everybody else and get to know them who works for that company. But I also think that for somebody like this man who got sort of nickname, I think playfully, the keg gorilla within his company.
We hope
He
playfully.
comes from a working class blue collar background, right? And he was drawn to that. Working with his hands is something he really emphasized to me. And he's got these big, calloused hands. Is very kind of visceral, and I mean, I think that he loved being in an environment that was not only familiar in a blue collar, labor sense, but also had this added dimension that he, at least in his career, had never seen before, had never been a part of, that he felt like he was part of a family.
Mm,
And yes, it's easy to kind of play glass half empty there. Hey, that's a convenient, somewhat exploitative or exploitative adjacent narrative that we're all a big family here. But it meant something to him. And it gave him purpose for why he was doing what he was doing, even if it was not clear how he could transition to a job on that creative pathway, right? It
yeah.
was not clear how someone like Josiah or this man we're talking about could easily make, it's sort of an ascendant, stepwise move into a role of more sort of authority and, higher earnings. But he still found value in what it meant to put his head down, lift those kegs, right? And be part of that company.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a question from I don't know who it was, but someone submitted it when they RSVP'd here, and I think this we've touched on this a little bit, but this is more of a historical perspective rather than a tactical perspective. The question is as follows: are there any particular previous periods in U.S. history that you think offer comparisons for the labor situation in the modern craft beer industry? Um, what does that do for you? Like, take us down whatever road you want to go there. But like, are there parallels that you found in your research that are compelling given the
Mhm.
state of the modern craft beer industry?
Yeah, I
or
mean,
not,
gosh.
which may be its own sort of point of interest.
Yeah, yeah. Man, I wish there was, that's a great question. It's a timely one too, right? I think it's on a lot of our minds as some of that industry downturn has really set, has come into focus. Um, it's interesting. I'm not enough of an expert going back to like that old arts and crafts movement back in that
Yeah,
sort
yeah.
of late 1800s, early 1900s to know what was the union presence. I've I would tentatively say it was fairly minimal amongst sort of the craftsmen of a previous era.
Hmm.
So I don't know if that gives us much hope on that front. It's interesting to think about the history of beer coming from a more domestic trade. That's also fairly bleak in terms of a labor unionizing prospects. In that, right, beer has this long history as a domestic chore prior to the industrial period,
Right,
more associated
right.
with women. That also doesn't really speak to like labor organizing, right, in the
Hmm.
modern sense. I don't know. I mean, I would almost want to turn that question back to others who might have more expertise on this call, because I'll be honest, I don't, it's a great question. I don't have a great answer to it.
Yeah, no, fair enough. I mean, the craft brewing industry is an aberration in some ways, and maybe this is one of the ways in which it's aberrant. I mean, it's possible that there isn't a good comp, which is
I,
also
yeah.
sorry, go ahead.
Well, I'll also add that, it's funny, a journalist contacted me who was writing an article about the craft coffee scene, or sometimes called third wave coffee. And that journalist was interested in the exact same question about craft coffee, right?
Yeah,
How do we organize these folks, these baristas working in these tiny little, kind of artisan coffee spaces? So I guess to give us maybe a touch of hope, or a way to continue that conversation elsewhere, I think there's a lot of people thinking about this in various kinds of craft spaces that might be, otherwise atomized, right? Kind of not talking to each other, but thinking through exactly these same things. Like, look,
yeah,
at the end of the day, once the passion fades and we're concerned about quality jobs and retaining, folks who are working in our industry, what do we do?
yeah.
So maybe there's that.
And also raising the floor on the quality of the product too. I mean, that's something that comes up in my reporting a lot when I do speak with workers that are organizing in the craft brewing space or in the craft coffee space, third wave coffee, whatever they call it. Is that like they're frustrated that they don't have the time and space to produce work product that they're proud of. And the reason I got into this business was to make beer that I'm proud of, or to make, to roast coffee that I'm proud of. If I don't get that, then it's not like I'm here for the fucking money.
No.
And if I'm not being given the time and space to produce that, then I need to build collective power to be able to demand that time and space, which ultimately, at least in the most, sort of halcyon version of this, can be a win-win for management and labor. Of course, any bosses on this call might not see it that way. I don't think we have. Kate, do we allow bosses in the guild or no? Is this a boss-free
I don't think
environment?
the guild has an official position on that, but
Okay.
no, I see no reason to not speak your mind on this topic here
Yeah,
tonight.
yeah. Well, right. So the bosses, yeah, they're not, we don't have to worry about the feelings of the bosses on this. Eli, the book is Handcrafted Careers. We've gone the distance here, but there's so much more to talk about. I mean, we could go for hours. Thank you for entertaining my rambling, and I think entertaining all of my fellow guild members as well. I found this to be an incredibly insightful and illuminative conversation about something I report about a lot, but don't get the opportunity necessarily to go longitudinal, as you say, and really think about it in the holistic sense that you did in the book. Again, Handcrafted Careers, folks, on the happy hour, highly recommend. It's Working the Artisanal Economy of Craft Beer is the subtitle. It's by Dr. Eli Wilson. Any final thoughts for us? This motley crew of beer journalists that you have at your disposal.
Yeah, well, first of all, let me just say I'm super honored to be here because I'm looking at the names and some of the faces on the call, and it's folks. All of you are folks that I've read. Some of you have cited your work in this book. I mean, it was, I love the work you're doing, and I'm really excited to see what beer journalism looks like, covering an industry that is kind of changing and morphing right before our eyes. Gosh, when I look at the craft beer world right now and I think about myself and what I experienced 10, 12, 14 years ago, it's like I can barely recognize what I'm seeing,
Yeah,
right?
totally.
And
Yeah.
it's almost like a nostalgia has set in before we even had time to really relish in the good times. Um, so anyway, I'm just so excited to see what kind of reporting comes out of all this in the future.
Well, we look forward to you synthesizing it into the book that you write in the future as well. So yeah, Kate, go ahead.
Can I ask one final question? Hopefully it's really short. Dr. Wilson, do you have another book coming up? Um, you've, and if so, is it related to beer or alcohol
Ooh,
or
you
beverages?
know, I expect to be around craft beer, doing writing and thinking about it, doing kind of follow-ups for a while. I will say that the next major book, I'm kind of pivoting a little bit. I'm on sabbatical right now. And I've gotten really interested in studying what I'm calling lifestyle work. It's a little bit of a pivot, maybe not so much. People who work in what is, kind of wellness spaces, doing yoga retreats. And, I kind of see this as this sort of brave new world. And, I'm not sure it's necessarily a good one, but it's an interesting frontier for a sociologist to kind of take on. So that's kind of in the future in terms of research. But again, I expect to be around craft beer for a long time. And I hope I'm welcome.
I do like that you're just kind of following interests into various like gentrified industries that like like have been co-opted and repackaged for a wealthier consumer than they were initially intended. That's good. I don't know. Is that something that can make it into your book? Is there a way that you can Venmo me for that insight, perhaps?
Yeah, yeah. Cite Infante, this call, gentrified labor. That's sort of
There you
on my
go. That's
finger.
that one's free. Okay, that's look. Thank you again so much, Eli. This was really a pleasure. I had a blast, and I think everyone else did. Although no questions from the audience
Oh,
today. Kate, is that normal? Do people not ask questions?
People are so shy on these sometimes.
Oh my
No, I
god.
know. I know.
Uh
We got like one anonymous
well,
question ahead of time.
I'm
well,
I'm happy to return in the future if suddenly the floodgates open and and maybe as I see that comment, maybe more people engage with the book and I'm happy to come back. In fact, I should have asked whether it was appropriate to treat this as a literal happy hour and
some
open.
people do. Some
Oh,
people do.
shoot. Always. Yeah. Sorry. That should have been a given.
Um, And also, I guess, I mean, since we do have journalists on the call, I would consider Dr. Wilson as a source on this stuff. When you guys are I mean, I don't mean to tell you guys how to do your reporting, but consider him. I'm going to call him. I'm going to get a quote from you, Eli. We're going to move some copies. Let's get this thing into the zeitgeist. While anyone
Totally, I'm
still gives a
hoping.
shit about labor, we may as well, we may as well give it a shot here.
I'm totally open.
Cool.
Green light. If anyone wants to contact me, I'm happy to follow up.
Very good. All right. All right,
All right. Well,
man.
thank you, Dave. Thank you again, Eli. Thanks everyone for joining. Yes, reach out to Eli if you have individual questions you'd like to follow up on, read the book. And thanks everyone for being here and for being part of the guild. And we'll see everybody next time.